Hey everyone, welcome back to another edition of Novelists Unwind. I'm really excited to have Rick Berry with us. Rick, I think you're only the second male author I've had that I've interviewed.
Male authors tend to be outnumbered, from my observation, about 9 to 1.
They are. Yeah, especially in the inspirational market. I don't know if that's true in the general market or not, but yeah,
I've noticed the trend.
it's very lopsided. So I'm really glad to have you here. Rick writes World War II stories and novels, and I read the Methuselah Project several weeks ago and was very intrigued by it. So I'm really glad to have Rick here. But before we even get into the story, Rick, I just want if you could share with us some of your experiences, life experiences, because it's just been amazing, some of the opportunities you've had and languages you speak.
I'll start with the languages.
Okay.
When I was in 9th grade, I had to sign up for something in high school. So I went, I needed an elective, how about French? So I studied French for that year, and I ended up liking it so much that by my second year, I took French 2, Spanish 1.
Wow.
I liked it so much, by my third year of high school, I took French 3, Spanish 2, German 1. And when I graduated, they gave me a special award just for foreign language achievement in high school. I had to get special permission, but I maxed out every language I could.
That's amazing. Did you not ever get them mixed up? How was it studying those different, and especially at that age? I don't know
if I didn't get them mixed up, but what was hard was every Friday when we would have our quiz on the vocabulary for that chapter, I was just memorizing words in foreign languages like crazy and trying to be ready for the Friday quiz. And sometimes it just felt like my brain was going to explode. I was just memorizing all the time.
Wow.
But it turned out that the Lord used that interest in foreign languages later on, and He's blessed me with opportunities to travel the world and to go on to learn the Russian language and to use that extensively in ministry. So those first ones, the European languages, I should say the Romance languages of French and Spanish, they were like a stepping stone to what the Lord eventually had in store for me.
I guess, just from what I've heard, Russian is very different from those other three, though, right? Was it?
It's very different.
Yeah.
A different pronunciation, extremely different in the alphabet. You probably noticed that Russian has 33 Cyrillic letters compared to our 26. And some words are pronounced in Russian in such a strange way. For example, the word for hello is здравствуйте, which starts with a Z and a D and an R. And in English, you can't do that. You've got to have between those consonant clusters. But Russians have no sweat about it.
Wow. Do you have an American accent when you speak Russian, or are you fluent enough to have overcome that?
An accent. But I praise the Lord that when I first went over there in 1987, all I had to do was open my mouth and people were like, oh, I didn't know you were American. and I took a trip from Moscow to Kazan, Russia. That's about 400 miles east of Moscow. And I was the only American in my compartment with 3 other people. And when the conductors came and sold us some tea and some snacks, I was asking questions to her in Russian. And when she left, the guy across from me said, I'm curious from your accent where you might be from. And I thought it was still obvious where I was from. So internally, I'm thinking, yes, they can't tell anymore. So I said, well, guess. And instead of saying the U.S., he said, well, maybe the Czech Republic. And on the inside, I'm thinking, thank you, Lord. I'm glad to get somewhere with this language. And I said, well, west of here is correct, but not the Czech Republic. And so the next fellow says, I think he sounds like he's maybe from pre-Baltica, Lithuania, Latvia, maybe. And once again, I'm thinking, yes, thank you, Lord. And then the final person said, I think I've got it figured out. How about Finland? Well, nobody gets the United States. So when I said, no, I'm an American, their eyes got big. Like, Americans don't learn Russian. We have to learn English to talk to them. They don't learn ours. So it was fun.
That's just amazing. And I think just being able to have that ear and to pick up the languages like you did. And again, I mean, you're a high school kid and this is what you're just so interested in doing. That's really cool.
It began as just a whim, and then it became almost like a hobby.
Yeah.
And it would be fun to bring home books from the library. The Little Prince in the original Russian, if you know that story.
Yes, I do, actually.
And just to practice, I'm planning on possibly taking a missions trip to Russia this July, and to reacquaint my ear with the words. I've been watching movies before bedtime in Russian. Lord of the Rings right now, dubbed into Russian language.
Oh my God.
Yeah, the guy who plays Smeagol, Gollum, he does this really slimy Russian accent. It's really cool.
That's amazing. Oh my gosh. And then the Elvish too. Do you know Elvish?
I do not know Dwarvish or Elvish. No, I'm calling it quits on those kind of languages.
Oh my gosh, that's so cool though. You know, when I read years and years ago, I read Les Mis and just fell in love with that story and thought it would be so cool to learn French just so I could read Les Mis in the original language. So I was at the bookstore and I picked up this book about, you know, I think it was like Dummy's Guide to Learning French or something like that. And one of the reasons to not learn French was to read Les Mis in the original language. So apparently I wasn't the only person who had that thought. Like, okay.
It's just something nicer about not needing somebody else to digest the conversation and then kind of summarize and say, well, he said this and she said that. Yeah. It's just so much better to have live one-on-one conversation with people, or to stand up in a pulpit and simply preach in my situation. Yeah. And I can remember a couple of years ago being in Fastov, Ukraine, and I was in the middle of my sermon, and all of a sudden it struck me, I shouldn't be able to do this. I'm just a guy from a small dinky town in Michigan that nobody's ever heard of. I shouldn't be able to stand here and preach in Russian. I felt like Peter walking on the water, doing something that I couldn't do, except with the Lord's blessing and help, I was able to do it.
You did it, yeah, yeah. So you grew up in Michigan?
I did grow up in Michigan, lived here until 18 years old, and then I went away for years. I just moved back to Michigan 2 years ago. Okay. My elderly father is having some physical difficulties, and his memory is not so hot anymore. And so I'm back in Michigan to help him for as long as he needs.
Oh, great. Because you lived in, my internet's acting up a little bit, so we may have a little bit glitches, but everyone just bear with us through this. You've lived in Indiana, though, for...
I spent from 1987 up until December of 2015 in Indiana. The reason for that is I've worked for two different Russian-based ministries. Indiana might seem like a funny place for a Russian, but the second one that I was with began in Chicago, but the cost of living in Chicago was just eating up a lot of the donations of the ministry. And so they looked for a less expensive place to live and to operate a Christian ministry, and Indiana was not far away, so Indianapolis became that place. Indianapolis
is nice too.
It's one of those big cities that retains a small town feel. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not like a Chicago or Manhattan. It's when you're in a big town, but you can be out in cornfields within minutes.
Right. I like that. Well, let's talk about your books. And the first one we're going to talk about, and I'm going to show it on my Kindle, the cover. So I'll show it as best I can. It's the Methuselah Project. There you go. And pardon?
My third novel.
Your third novel, right? And really good. I read it because, of course, my debut novel was a World War II novel, so I'm always kind of looking for those and enjoy reading them. But you've taken this twist because it starts out during World War II, but then you have this character who does not die, so he's alive.
Right.
Temporary time.
In fact, World War II ends, and my hero doesn't know that it ends. And
right.
I don't want to say so much that I will spoil the story for anyone who wants to read.
Exactly.
But at the chapter 1, the hero of my story, Captain Roger Green, he's a P-47 pilot. He considers himself born to fly, a natural-born aviator who just wants to be in the air more so than on the ground. And in the course of saving his wingman, he gets shot down. He basically is ready to surrender his life for the sake of his wingman. Mm-hmm. And so he intervenes, gets shot down, and rather than taking him to a POW camp, the Germans decide, let's use this specimen for that top secret experiment that we've been looking for a man to use as a guinea pig. And so he's taken to a secret facility, and when the war ends, he doesn't know about it because he's still the subject of an ongoing experiment.
This just kept hidden for all these years. And I don't want to do any spoilers either, but a couple of the reviews mentioned that it was almost like Captain America in reverse because it's the Germans doing it instead of the Americans trying to create this super soldier. And did that play any part in your inspiration for the story, or what inspired you to come up with this kind of a plot?
Not the Captain America movies. Matter of fact, the first time somebody said it reminded them of Captain America, I was kind of offended and thinking,
oh no.
These stories are totally different. But a number of other people started mentioning how it reminded them of Captain America.
Mm-hmm.
I thought, well, okay, on the surface, you got a guy from the 1940s who's the subject of an experiment.
Yeah.
And that much, there is a similarity for sure. However, my man, he doesn't become a superhero. He doesn't have superpowers. His body does undergo a change because of the experiment, but he's not like he's super strong. He doesn't carry a shield. And, he's just well, once again, I'm tempted to say too much.
I know, we don't want to do that.
Right, but the essence for the story actually began before the very first Captain America movie came out. And I remember talking with a literary agent, I think it was about 2008, at an American Christian Fiction Writers Conference, about the idea for my story. And he said, well, if you could pull it off, go ahead. So I was working on it in 2008 and 2009. And so the Captain America movies really had no influence on my imagination at that point. And as far as not dying, yes, the character does end up living in our time, but he doesn't get frozen in a block of ice. And I was looking for a way to bring a 1940s airman into our present time without aging him. Mm-hmm. And I didn't want to, I did think in passing, I don't want to, have him frozen or suspended animation, something like that. That's been done not just with Captain America, but Mel Gibson did it with a movie called Forever Young. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to find some other way to bring it about. And so having him captured and then taken to a secret facility where he became one of several Allied Americans subjected to this experiment, that became my tool to create a almost believable way of bringing somebody from back then to our time without aging him.
Yeah, and it works. I mean, it was a good plot line. I think it really added to the story to see what he had to undergo all those years. And like you said, did not even realize the war had ended, did not have any clue what was going on.
Yeah, the scientists that were holding him and using him as a guinea pig, their thinking was that if we tell him the war is over and we don't let him go, that he will just go into despair, despondency. Mm-hmm. He might even kill himself. But as long as he thinks that maybe the Allies might eventually win and come and rescue him, then he will have hope. And so therefore they start feeding him just a fantasy about the situation concerning the war news.
It's so interesting, so intriguing. And now, okay, two things. First, though, you said you started writing it in about 2008, but it was published in 2015. So you had quite a journey there.
There was quite a journey.
Yeah.
And the novel took a number of different steps to create it. And I went to various conferences. I kicked the idea around with various publishers. Mm-hmm. And one publisher was extremely interested in the story until they found out, A, the main character was not a woman, but a man, and that it covers about 70 years in time. And they thought, well, between those two factors, we're just kind of leery of this project. We don't want to get involved. And so, and that was when I didn't have a literary agent shopping it for me. Mm-hmm. But once again, at an ACFW conference, I just struck up a conversation with a literary agent while we're waiting for the doors to the dining room to open. And by the time we finished that conversation, I wasn't even pitching. I was just talking about writing. She said, I'd like you to send me that manuscript. And so I sent it. And she offered representation, and the rest is history.
Yay!
So for people who go to writers' conferences and they don't necessarily get the meeting of their dreams with the editor or the agent that they wanted, that's not the end of the story. You can strike up a conversation just in a hallway or a corridor, and maybe you'll garner some interest.
Yeah, you never know. And I'm excited to hear you talk about American Christian Fiction Writers, because I'm a member of that. I've helped with starting a couple different chapters, one in Central Florida, one in Memphis. And I know from reading your bio, you've been very involved with an ACFW chapter in Indiana for quite a while.
I was the president of the Indiana chapter for about 6 years. And it was kind of funny because when they first asked me if I would run for office of the board, I'd only been in ACFW for maybe 6 months.
Oh, wow.
they asked if I would run for president. I thought, I don't even know what I'm doing. No, I won't. They said, well, would you run for vice president? And I said, if you want me to have my hat in the ring, you can put me down for vice president. We'll see what happens. Well, I won that. And 2 months later, the person who was the president said, I just can't handle it. I've got too much going on in my life. Rick, you're the president now. So one way or another, they kind of roped me into it. And surprise. So I didn't know what I was doing for the first year, I'm sure. But I kept experimenting and trying things out. And eventually it worked.
Oh, good. That's kind of how I became president of the Central Florida chapter several years ago, too, was when I was vice president, the president decided to step down. It's like, okay, here we go.
It's almost like a literary candid camera. Just when you least expect it, smile. You're now the president of this chapter.
So, and then the other thing I want to talk about was, I'm going to show the cover again, because notice the guy, everybody, wearing the bomber jacket. And this is a jacket that you actually own.
I do own that.
So how did the cover shoot take place? So how did all that happen?
There's a story in that as well. I had requested up front a complimentary look at the cover before it went to press, because I've heard so many horror stories of covers that don't match the novel at all.
Right.
And when the publisher sent me what they thought was going to be a rough mock-up for the cover, I said, well, the character it's a good-looking guy and no problem there, but he had a very modern 21st century looking jacket on. And in the course of the Methuselah Project, I referred to him having this flight jacket,
right?
It's called an A4 in World War II lingo, and it comes up a number of times. And so to have the cover being a very modern jacket as opposed to a World War II flight jacket, it just didn't jive at all. And so when I wrote back and said, keep everything the way it is except put an old-fashioned jacket on them, they said, A, we don't have an old-fashioned jacket, and B, we don't have time. We're supposed to print this thing on Friday. I said, I have one of these jackets. I'll send it to you. You can put it on the guy. They said, we don't have time for that either. And the final line was that if you are that concerned about it, you put the jacket on, get a good photographer to take some pictures of you, and we will Photoshop that jacket onto our cover that we already have.
Is that what they did?
It's not just the jacket, the shoulders and down are Rick Barry. And from the neck up, it is the model that was in the original version.
So there we go. So the shoulders down are you.
Yes, it is. Not that anybody would know. But if they flip over the Methuselah Project and look at the author bio on the back of the book, it has me wearing my jacket, and it is actually the same one that the model is wearing.
That is so cool.
And nobody can tell. Nobody that I haven't revealed that story to can tell that it was Photoshopped.
Oh, no, they did a great job.
It was fantastic. So just seamless.
That is a terrific story. I love it.
I still laugh about it when I think about all that we went through in those last couple of 48 hours to get the right jacket on the right guy before printing time.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Well, there you go. But yeah, and it's a great looking cover. So then your next step.
The cover that's funny is at the top of the cover has the main characters, Roger and Catherine, and at the bottom it has an old P-47 fighter plane. And those two different elements have appealed to two totally different kinds of readers. One young woman wrote to me an email and said that I bought your book, and it was sitting on my kitchen table when my girlfriend came in, and she took one look at the eyes of that guy and said, oh, I want to read a book about a guy like that. And so she was attracted to the male model. A little while later, the book was still on the kitchen table. Her father comes in. He takes one look at the P-47 and says, you got a book about fighter planes? I want to read your World War II story. And so they were lining up to read her book, but for different reasons.
That's really cool. So yeah, so Kriegel, right, is the publisher. They did a great job then of matching those two things in one cover. That's pretty clever.
Yes, I thought it was a good job of drawing in two diverse kinds of audiences. If it had just had the man and woman, it might have looked too much like a simple love story. And so people who like World War II wouldn't have even known it had a historical bent to the story.
And it's not just a romance. I mean, it's
nothing except the fighter plane. Well, people who want the relationship between the man and the woman, they wouldn't have picked it up.
Exactly. Yeah. And I do want to say it's not the typical romance story. It's much more than that.
It combines threads of at least three different genres. It's got the historical, it's got the suspense, but it has a thread of romance that is woven there.
It does.
And some people have said, well, it even has a science fiction aspect to it because the Methuselah Project, there never was such a project. The Germans did many experiments on prisoners, but they never did this particular experiment, trying to make somebody live longer and heal faster from wounds.
Yeah. And now you have written a screenplay. You've turned this into a screenplay.
I did. I have an interest in helping script filmmakers to create quality, wholesome, Christian, God-glorifying films.
Sure.
And I took a class in California for how to write screenplays called How to Succeed in Hollywood, hosted by Dr. Ted Baer of Movie Guide. And so I took the class and I did a couple of efforts to practice projects. And the Movie Guide, every year they host an annual prize, a competition called the Kairos Prize. And it's got two divisions, a pro division for people with a background in filmmaking and some experience behind them, and then another division for newcomers. It was a $15,000 prize for the best wholesome, God-glorifying screenplay by a newbie like me. I'm a newbie when it comes to that genre. And the first 2 years that I entered projects, I never heard anything back, which is another way of saying you didn't win. You didn't come close. But this last year in February, they whittled down hundreds of submissions from 20 plus countries. I don't know how many countries. I just know it was more than 20. And when all the dust settled, the Methuselah Project as a screenplay was one of the last 10, the finalist 10 list.
That's great.
If I hadn't made it that time, I might have thought, well, I just don't have what it takes for this. Maybe I'm not getting it. And writing a screenplay is a totally different critter from writing a novel. And I had spent years studying the novel and had much less experience studying scripts. And I might have just thrown in the towel and thought, well, I just don't have what it takes. But that was an encouragement. And Dr. Baer himself, the man who was the head of Movie Guide, he came over at breakfast the next morning at the hotel and just really encouraged me to keep on practicing. He said he voted for mine, which was nice. But I didn't win, but at least it was a pat on the back that were like no.
Yeah, it's affirmation, and I love that. So now, were your first two screenplays the same, or did you do a different project each year?
The first screenplay I did and submitted was totally different. It was actually a science fiction story. Okay. My second effort was the Methuselah Project, but it was my first time attempting that as a screenplay. And the last fall, when they announced the parameters and the prize for this year's Kairos Prize again, I decided to open up the file, take a second look, and study it closer and see if I couldn't polish it up. And what I found when I opened up the PDF of my submission from last year was, oh my word, this is horrible. No wonder I didn't win. and so I sat down with my books on formatting and my advice books on proper screenplay creation. And I just went through the whole thing. I took 30 days and I revamped, I cut and slashed and glued in more pieces until I had a totally reworked version of the Methuselah Project as a script. And that's the one that made the finalist 10 list.
That's great. Well, congratulations on that. That is just wonderful.
Thank you. Yeah. And I did go to Hollywood for the final gala dinner, their Movie Guide's annual dinner, in which they pay tribute to the scripts, the screen and the screenwriters and the people who create professional Christian films. And they had a big dinner. I got to meet some famous folks and kind of hobnob with others who like story making. And that's fun too. And no matter whether you're talking about a movie or a novel, people who enjoy stories enjoy stories.
Yeah, they do. They do. Well, that's really cool. That's cool. So the Methuselah Project is your third book. Tell us a little bit about the other two that you've written.
The very first one that I tried as a novel, and I should preface this by saying that I've written since college. I've written devotionals, short stories. I do short stories for Focus on the Family and for other organizations. I edit for Answers in Genesis. So I've done a lot of work on shorter works, but I had never done a novel before. And so when I turned my thoughts and my efforts toward novel writing, I did a fantasy story called Curious Quest. Lord of the Rings is still my favorite novel to this day. So that was my inspiration, but I didn't want to do a copycat story.
Sure.
Curious Quest is much simpler than Lord of the Rings. Everything is simpler than the Lord of the Rings. I don't make up foreign languages for elves. But it's closer, I would say, to Chronicles of Narnia than it would Tolkien's work.
Mm-hmm.
And there are people out there who are fans of fantasy who like it. One man he's older now, but when he was in 7th grade, he hid under the blankets with a flashlight to finish the story because he was supposed to go to bed and he wanted to finish the story. It was his favorite novel.
Nice.
So, but after that was said and done, I thought, okay, I got my foot into publishing novels. I got my toe wet, but I don't think I want to stay in fantasy. And so that's when I started researching my next novel, Gunner's Run. It's about a machine gunner from a B-24 bomber who he's on a mission over Germany. And when the bomb bay's doors are open, he accidentally tumbles out.
Oh,
now, his chest parachute that the crewman used to wear, it saves his life. But there he is on foot and alone in Nazi Germany, watching his buddies fly away. And he's alone in the last place in the world he'd ever want to be, which is Hitler's backyard, basically.
Of course. Wow.
And so Gunner's Run is the story of him making a run across Europe, trying to stay one step ahead of the Germans who know he's there, and they're trying to capture him. And he's trying to get back to England before he's killed or captured.
Wow, wow.
A lot of research. There's no science fiction at all in that one. I just wanted to make a good, very realistic, believable adventure yarn about a 19-year-old who had signed up for military duty because he was mad at God for letting his Christian mom die. But as he's step by step running across Europe, he realizes, I do need God's help. And he starts recalling the lessons that his Christian mom told him from the Bible when he was younger.
I like that idea. I'm going to have to get that book and read it. His last name is Yoder, but is he Amish in your stories, or an Amish connection?
His last name is Yoder because he's from Indiana.
Okay.
And in Indiana, there are a lot of Amish and there's a lot of Mennonites, and both groups have a lot of Yoders in their genealogy. And so I thought, well, if he's from Indiana, I want a typical Hoosier name, and Yoder just came to the surface.
And it worked.
My working title was Yoder's War. But when it went to the publisher, somebody there kind of shot that down and said, this sounds like some kind of a prairie skirmish between farmers. And so they thought they needed something that was more directly tied to World War II. So that's when it went from Yoder's War to Gunner's Run.
Right.
And I actually liked their suggestion better, so we ran with that.
Yeah, the publishers do have a talent for coming up with good titles for the book.
Yes, praise the Lord.
Yes,
yeah. That's the kind of thing, though, that if you take it personally, when they suggest, you know, it's almost like, this is my baby, what do you think? And they say, well, your baby has a funny looking nose. Let's change the nose. If you take it personally, you can be offended. But really, they're the ones, if you're going with a traditional publisher, that are in the business. And they've seen titles come and go, and they've seen titles flop. And it behooves you to take their advice.
I think so. I agree. So did your interest in World War II come from your travels, or from, I mean, like why World War II? Why is that your thing?
Ever since 7th grade, I've had a long-lasting interest in the period of World War II. And I can even recall how that started. Christmas time of my 7th grade year, my family was visiting relatives in Detroit. And during the course of that evening, somebody turned on the TV, and some of the men were gathered around in the living room watching this World War II story, and I came in the middle of it. The story was one that a lot of people would recognize. It's The Great Escape.
I love that movie.
It was a captivating story, and I thought it was just a story. And of course, I'd heard of World War II and read about it a little bit, but I didn't know a lot of details as a 7th grader. And when they before rolling the credits at the end, they put up a little notice that this was dedicated to those who never returned, to those who had been shot by the Germans rather than bring them back to the POW camp. Yeah. I thought, what? That really happened? And it just sparked my interest in learning more about prison camps and people who escaped. And so I'd read book after book after book during my junior high and high school years, and even into college. And so this background of reading about World War II and escaping was there, and it eventually provided a form of fertilizer for my own novel about a man who escapes from the Germans and is trying to get back home.
Yeah, that's terrific. That's terrific. All right, well, I want to give you a chance to tell people where they can connect with you. You like Facebook, and they can find you at rick.barry.184. It's Barry.
If you just type Rick Barry, there's about 6 or 7 pages of Rick Barry. So
are there really?
yeah, it's a popular name.
I would say the perils of having a popular name when you're an author. There's a lot of Johnnie Alexanders too, but I'm the only girl. So I was like, look for me. And so it's rickcbarry.com. And you've got some really fun things on your website. Tell us about your fun and free page and some of the things you have on there.
Well, there's a little bit about me, and I tried to make it kind of lighthearted. And
it is. It's cool.
I figured nobody is going there really to find out so much about me. They're looking to find out what is in it for me here. What does Rick have to offer me? More books? And so for one thing, I have a bookstore, and my 3 novels are the first 3 there. But I've also picked out a number of novels by other fellow Christian inspirational authors that typically tie into World War II, and offer those as other reading. If they've read all of mine and they want something in a similar vein or about the similar time period, I have some things to offer there. There's a press kit about me with photos that can be downloaded. Probably not many people do that, I imagine, unless they're writing a blog article. Sure. And there's some fun freebies. The very last link, I just wanted to be nothing about me, nothing about my books, but just some fun things that people can do. And actually, I need to be updating that and add some more things. But there are some things that click on it, and it will take you there and show you some opportunities just for fun.
It was cool to see it, because it's not something I've seen on anyone else's author's website. So like you have a link to an orchestra by Glenn Miller. So, it's very popular during World War II. So you can click on that and listen to his band.
Right. And when I was writing Gunner's Run, I tell people that for 6 months of my life, I lived in 1943.
Yeah.
And if I watched a movie, it was usually an old movie about World War II, black and white. Yeah. If I listened to music, it was Glenn Miller and his orchestra, or Tommy Dorsey, or other World War II era music. And I just developed a real fondness for that era of music. And even my mom kind of laughs and says, it's so funny that you weren't even born until years after the war, and you're listening to this stuff that was around when I was a kid.
You're going, yeah, but it's good stuff, right? It's good stuff. So that was
it has no thumbs.
Yeah, and then you also have a link to a place where you can do some photo things, because you've got like a picture of a magazine that has like you in a spread with the picture of the cover of Methuselah Project and picture of you. And I played around a little bit with that. That was fun.
Yeah, it's a quick way, without being a Photoshop genius, to take a JPEG of your own, cover of a book, or your own photo, and just have some fun with it and make it in a professional setting. Yeah. On my Facebook page, and here, this is true confession time. I've produced my own little advertisements for my books from time to time, just different things. And I've used those kind of programs to make professional looking posters of my book on display on the streets of Spain or in Paris. And it looks like somebody's walking past or bicycling past my book plastered on the wall, 8 foot tall. It's just,
that's cool. I didn't think to do that when I was doing other pictures, but I should, I'll put my cover up there for that girl on the bicycle.
There you go.
That was so cool. So you're working on a sequel for the Methuselah Project.
I am. When I wrote the Methuselah Project, the original, I did it as a standalone, but I purposely left enough loose ends, you could say, enough strings hanging, so that there would be plenty of fodder for a follow-up book if it was popular. And there's been enough people in the reviews on Amazon and other places that said, I'd really like to know what happens to these characters next. What happens to this guy? So I decided to bite the bullet, and a lot of things have gotten in my way, slowed me down, including writing the screenplay. I totally set aside the sequel while I was working on that screenplay 2 times. But I'm up to word count about 85,000 now, which means I'm in the final stretch, and the end is getting close for the sequel. So I'm excited about it. I think it's a cool story. Sequels are often not as good as the original, but I'm liking how it's turning out.
Oh, good. Now, will Kriegel be publishing it, or do you know yet?
They haven't seen it yet.
Okay.
So I can't say yes or no on that, but if they say no, I'll either offer it to somebody else or I'll just self-publish. And
Yeah.
I believe in the story that strongly.
Yeah, I'm kind of in that same situation with a story a World War II story I'm working on. It's like, I'm hoping somebody picks it up, but if not, it's going to get out there.
You know, and in the past, this is one of the marvelous things about being a writer in the time that we're in. In the past, if you could spend a year of your life writing your heart out, and it turns out that nobody wants it.
Exactly.
But now if nobody wants it and you still have confidence in it, you can make it a dream a reality.
Exactly. Because the truth is, the slots for fiction are in the inspirational market are very few, and they seem to be declining. And so there are a lot of great stories out there that just can't find a home because there aren't that many spaces.
Right.
So, yeah.
I think the younger generation especially is looking for wholesome Christian science fiction or fantasy. But the traditional publishers that are used to doing women's romance or prairie romance, Amish stories, they wouldn't know how to market that stuff if they had a good one.
Yeah.
So people more and more are turning to self-publishing. And maybe they won't hit the 20,000 bracket, but at least their story gets out there to those who appreciate it.
Exactly. There's a readership for them. Well, this has been so cool. It's been so nice to have you on here. The very last question I always ask is, when you get to the end of a story, you finally, been working on it, finally hit the end, what do you do to unwind?
After shouting hallelujah and clapping my hands. Of course, when you type the end, that's not really the end.
No, it's not.
In my mind, here's how I describe it to people. Writing a novel is kind of like making a snow sculpture. You start out with a lot of loose stuff out there blanketing the whole ground. You've got to pile it up and pack up a bunch of stuff. And once you get a big enough pile of snow, you can take out your spoons and knives and you can start sculpting it and make a statue out of it.
Right.
And that's the way it is with a novel. There are billions of words out there in the world. And you've got to scoop up enough words and pack them into sentences and to create a shape. It's not done at the end, but that's something that you can begin working with. And then you go back and you edit, you polish, you cut, and you trim, and you streamline some sentences until you end up with this final, hopefully, a glistening, polished version of your story. And so, but I do at least breathe a sigh of relief, because to me, the editing process is where the real magic happens. Up until then, it's just scooping together words and sentences and trying to get your general story there, and then you can have fun with it.
Yeah, I like the editing process too, when you've already sort of have the basics and you can manage it and rework it and revise it and make it happen.
Some people hate the revision stage, but I really like it.
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool. Well, Rick, thanks again so much. It was so great having you here.
Thank you for the invitation, Johnny. I've appreciated it. It's been fun.
It has been a lot of fun. Thank you. And everybody, just glad you're with us too, and can't wait to see you next time on Novelists Unwind. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.